Hi everybody, welcome to ChessLecture.com. This is International Master David Vigorito, and today we're going to be looking at the first game from the Kramnik-Topalov match that's going on right now. It's very exciting, reuniting the different titles. Chess has been a little like boxing in the last decade or so with the different titles. So now we have a match between Kramnik, who a lot see as the true world champion because he beat Kasparov. Some will say that he's not because he hasn't really played. He only defended his title against Lecco, and Topalov, of course, is now the highest-rated player in the world, and he won the very strong tournament in San Luis, Argentina last year. So this is really good for chess. I think that this match is occurring, and we're reuniting the title, and different people have different perspective on what's going to happen in this match. Of course, it's very easy for me to pick Kramnik because he won this first game. Kramnik is probably my favorite player. And I'm a big Topalov fan, too, but Topalov, after he won the San Luis tournament, he started kind of talking a little trash about Kramnik, saying he's like, his rating's so low now, why should he get to play me? But we have to remember that Kramnik has a tremendous personal score against Topalov. It's something like 10-5, and he's lost a couple games with White and the Sicilian, which is, now that Kramnik is back to not playing e4 so much, we've seen he's been playing very well. And it would not surprise me in the least if within a few months he's back up to #1 in the ratings within 6 months or a year. So let's start taking a look at the game, which Kramnik was white. Started d4, knight f6, c4, e6. It's good to see Kramnik playing d4 instead of playing e4. Jesse's done some lectures on Kramnik's return to knight f3. This is very similar, just a different move order. Kramnik, he didn't do so well with e4. He did okay, but really these closed positions are more in his style, and he has a lot more experience with them. So after e6, he did knight f3, and Topalov did d5. Of course, b6 is the other main move at high level, the Queen's Indian. And Kramnik played g3, the Catalan, which is an opening I've discussed a couple times here. It's a very annoying opening to face. Black is unlikely to lose in 15 moves or something, but really the danger for Black here is just getting a passive position and getting tortured. So let's see how Topalov handled this. He played what I think is the best system. He just did DC right away, which is the most active. And after bishop g2, he made this move bishop b4 check, which is a little unusual, I think. The main moves here are knight c6, bishop e7, and c5 are really the main lines, and also a6, sometimes combined with knight c6 as well. Knight c6 is kind of the most popular line now. So he did bishop b4 check, which is more common without taking on c4. You actually see this quite a bit in this position. Bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and then bishop e7. The idea is to give White this free move. Bishop d2 to avoid a setup where White does b3 and bishop b2. So that's a little more common, but what he did is a little unusual. DC, bishop g2, bishop e4 check, bishop d2, and now a5. This is a system I haven't really seen too much, but I guess there's nothing new under the sun, and this has been played a couple times. So Kramnik played bishop to queen to c2, and now really White's just going to take on c4 and have pressure on this diagonal. So Black has to kind of react forcefully. So now he takes on d2. If he plays b5 right away, then White can play a4, and if c6, a takes b5. This is an interesting tactical point, because if cb, then bishop takes b4, and there's a pin on the a file. And if he throws in bishop takes d2, suddenly White takes with this knight. And again, there's a problem on this diagonal for Black. So after queen c2, Black kind of has to change up his plan a little bit. And he takes on d2 right away. And now if knight b takes d2, then Black can indeed play b5. a5 almost looks kind of like a wasted move. But one funny point is that the rook can move. So now something like a4, c6, a, b, c, b, knight e5. Now, if the pawn was on a7, this rook would just be lost, but now Black could play something like rook a7 or rook a6. So White plays a move that I think was first played by Grandmaster Wojtkiewicz, who unfortunately recently passed away, way too young, and he played queen takes d2. So this, I actually witnessed this. Wojciech played this, I think, against Gulko in San Diego this year. He played queen takes d2, and Gulko played b6, and then after knight e5, rook a7, Wojciech played knight a3, and he got back the pawn, and even after like bishop b7, takes, like knight takes c4, the position's funny for black. This rook looks kind of silly. Even if black achieves c5 to kind of equalize the pawn structure, the rook's a little silly, so white was a little better there. I'm sure it was drawn anyway. But that's one possibility. So he did queen takes d2, and Topalov played c6. Again, I think this move a5 looks kind of funny here, but there's some tactical points, and these guys, of course, are preparing with computers all the time, so this makes a big difference in finding the reasons that a5 is a useful move. So now white has to kind of play concretely, because otherwise black will just eventually play b5 and be a pawn up. So first he plays a4, and now he's all set to play like knight a3 to get back the pawn. So black plays b5, and here is a point of queen d2 is revealed. He does ab, cb, and now of course if knight e5, which is rook a7 or rook a6, but he has this funny move, queen g5, which gets back the pawn. So this kind of tactically justifies white's gambit here. So black castles, and then after queen takes b5, at first this looks very good for white because these pawns on a5 and c4 look kind of silly. And there was one other game I found in this line that was recent where Grishik was white against Moisenko, and he did knight a6 in that game. And then after queen takes c4, knight b4, trying to get some play, threatening bishop a6. White just did queen b3, and soon black found himself down a pawn, really without enough compensation. So Topalov did have something prepared here, and he played bishop a6, protecting the c-pawn. And there's a couple points here. If he takes the pawn on a5 after bishop b7, attacking here, queen takes d8, instead of taking back on d8, after which black would just be a pawn down after rook d8, rook takes, black's going to lose this c-pawn too. There's a queen sacrifice here. He can play rook takes a1, and now if the queen moves, say to c7 or to b6, or e7, the only squares, then rook takes b1, king to d2, rook takes b2, king c1, and black can play c3. And this is pretty complicated. So, and I'm sure Topalov had analyzed this quite a bit. So Kramnik just played a pretty safe continuation. He played queen a4, hoping to gather up these pawns. And then after queen b6, he just offered the b pawn. He castled. He could try to protect this pawn with something like queen a3, but then after knight c6, black is fully developed. It's not so easy to win this c-pawn, and black can use the b4 square. So really black's pretty much okay here. So instead, he offers the pawn, castles, and after queen takes b2, knight d2, he just plans on winning back the c-pawn. So Topalov didn't want to hold on to this pawn. If he does c3, then rook fb1. So, and if he does queen b4 to try to hold the pawn, knight e5 is strong, because this is hitting the rook, and then he's all set to take the pawn. So instead he initiates a tactical sequence. He plays bishop to b5. And now what's white to do? Because if he moves the queen, then c3 will come. Like if queen a3, then c3 protects the queen, hits the knight, and also hits e2. And all this is very important, that black's rook here is not trapped because he's done a5. So he plays this strong move, knight takes c4, which just kind of initiates some trades. And the real thing here is it's not that hard to calculate this stuff here, materially speaking, but it's really about assessing the position. So after the somewhat forced sequence, bishop a4, knight b2, bishop b5, white plays knight e5, hitting the rook. And then after rook a7, e2 is attacked, so white plays bishop f3. He'd rather do this than play rook e1. If he does rook e1, he'll have to play e3 in order to move the rook again. So he'd much rather commit the bishop. So he plays bishop f3. And then after knight bd7, he's got quite a choice here. This is probably the first time white should really think if he's going to go to c4 or go to d3. They both have make some positional sense. He played knight c4, but he could also consider playing a knight to d3 to kind of watch these squares c5 and keep the eye on e5. He could also exchange pieces by playing knight c6, but after bishop c6, bishop c6, rook c8, black is pretty active. The bishop looks strong, but it's kind of just shooting into air, and black will just play knight b6 next. So Kramnik played the most solid move. He played knight e to c4. And then after rook b8, rook fb1. So if we take a look at this position, it looks to me like white is a little better, because the a-pawn looks like it's more likely to be weak than strong. Of course, really the worst thing that can happen for black is he loses the a-pawn, and then he'll have to really beg for a draw. But white has to be a little careful, because if he loses the initiative, this a-pawn could become strong. Now, Topalov has to figure out what to do here. He can either just sit, but then he has to be concerned that white will gradually win the a-pawn. And white might even play like e4 and d5 at some point. So Topalov comes up with a very good plan here. And what he does is he fights for control of the center in kind of an interesting way. He played this great move, g5. And the idea here is to play g4. Now, I think a lot of people would think that, well, you shouldn't really put this pawn on g4 because you have a light-squared bishop, and you don't really want to put it on the same color squares as your bishop. But here it's kind of important tactically. By playing g4, as we see in the game after he does e3, g4, bishop d1, by controlling f3 with this pawn, it helps black control e4, which helps him control d5. So really by pushing this g-pawn, it helps black control all these squares. And white's pawn majority is in the center with these pawns on e3 and d4. So now it's very hard for white to ever get like e4 and d5 rolling. So really white just has to try to concentrate on the queen side. And black gets counterplay with his following maneuver. So he does bishop c6, rook c1, bishop to e4, knight a4. These knights were a little funny, so now white's finally getting these knights active. Rook b4, knight d6, and now bishop f3. Now this is very double-edged, because if white moves the bishop, then he probably doesn't really have anything. So by taking on f3, now this is a position that's interesting. When I was watching this game, I wasn't even sure who's really better here. I kind of like white because I figure black has, weak pawns here and here. But white has to be very careful, because if white ever loses the initiative here, he's got to really watch out for any kind of potential rook b2 and like knight e4, and this pawn could suddenly become dangerous. So really, white would like to round up this pawn someday, but it's really not easy. So now they both maneuver a little bit, and he plays knight to c8. It was also possible to play something like knight c3 with the idea of trying to fight for this square. Really, white wants to be able to get to like d2, so if he can ever play knight e4 and then even knight d2 or maybe knight g5. Really wants to round up this pawn. So knight to c3 was another possibility. It's not so easy for white, though, because if these knights ever wander too far away to the king's side, suddenly this a pawn might have something to say. So he plays knight to c8, and this is interesting because black has to watch out for this possibility of knight to e7 to c6, which will attack various things over here. So he plays rook to a8, knight e7 check, king g7. This move to me definitely looks better than king to f8. On f8, the king can't really ever come further. If he had gone to f8 after knight c6, this king isn't really going anywhere. So then there might be some back rank checks at some point. So g7 looks more natural to me. So now he plays knight c6, rook b3, the most active square, knight c5, rook b5, and now this next move really surprised me. To me, it doesn't look like white ever wants to really have a pawn on c5, so I expected him to take on d7, takes, and then maybe play h3. h3 is a natural move. There's the possibility of playing g4 and king h2 to g3, and if black does h5, this has helped white a little bit because he controls the g4 square, and there's no back rank mate, so his rooks can move because he always has a little lift up here. But the way Kramnik played it in the game, to me, looked very suspicious. I haven't analyzed this with a computer. Maybe the computers will say that I'm crazy and that h3 is a brilliant move, but he played h3 right away. And to me, this move just looks wrong because it allows black to take on c5. And after rook c5, he has rook b2 right away, and the knight can come to e4, which isn't so easy to stop. So he plays rook g5 check, king h6. Now he grabs the pawn, rook a5, knight a5, and now knight e4. So this isn't so easy for white, because how do we protect f2? Well, the only way is by rook f1. And then after knight d2, rook c1, knight e4. Already black has a draw, even though black has lost the a pawn. Now, what's interesting here is that Topalov decides to play for a win. And I can understand this, because after rook f1, black is so active that the extra pawn is very unlikely to mean anything, and he can really just try to push white because of this. He has this draw with knight d2. And I think it was also an interesting moment psychologically, because even if they draw, Topalov has shown that he's trying to win. He's going to try to win with black, even though he's in this ending a pawn down. So even though he lost the game, I don't think that this was a mistake by Topalov to play this way. He tried to win. He plays f6, which makes some sense. Just taking away any possible knight c6 to e5, and black can still press by moving his king and playing h5, and even trying to zugzwang white. And white also has to worry about his knight that is just kind of out in no man's land on a5. So there's a possibility of it being trapped. So knight c6, knight d2, rook d1, knight e4, rook f1. This can be useful to throw in a repetition like this. Sometimes it's good to get close to time control, but I like it psychologically here, just kind of showing him that he can take the draw. And now again, he plays king g6, avoiding the draw again. Knight d8, rook b6. Now there's some little concern that this knight could get trapped. So rook c1 and h5. This is a great move. It's really the last thing that is not participating for black. So rook a1. White doesn't have a whole lot of moves. h4. And now this is a very tough decision for white. You don't really want to play g4, because then these pawns control so many squares. You're really never going to get out of this bind. So Kramnik made an interesting decision. He took on h4, which
makes his king side look weaker, but at least he's up 2 pawns now. So sometimes in a position like this will give white a couple of options. One, he can always kind of try to buy some freedom by giving up a pawn or even 2 pawns because he's up 2 pawns. And it also gives him the possibility, if things ever get desperate, he might be able to give up his knight for some pawns because black is running out of pawns. After g takes h4, king h5, rook to a2, king takes h4, king h2. Here he played king to h5, but there's another possibility here of playing knight g5. And this does a few things. It protects e6, it hits h3, and of course it protects f3. So it's not so easy for white to break the bind here. So this was definitely another way of continuing. But instead he chose to play king h5, rook c2. White doesn't have a whole lot to do. He's up a pawn, but I mean his extra pawn is this h3 pawn, which clearly isn't going anywhere. So really white is still just kind of trying to hold, but he should be able to hold. So black played king h6, rook a2, again just kind of doing nothing, king g6, rook c2. White just has to make sure his knight doesn't get trapped by some king walk over here. King f5, rook a2, rook b5, knight c6, rook b7. So now we see some possibilities for black here. There's this danger, rook g7, and rook g2. So this is something that white has to be careful of. So he plays rook a5 check, king g6, so that takes care of that for now. Rook a2, king h5. And now it's not so easy because now he's all set to play rook g7 to g2. And if he does rook a5 check, king h4, he's out of checks, f2 is hanging. There's a threat of rook g7, there's a threat of rook b2. So suddenly things look very scary for white. So Kramnik uncorks d5. Very good move. And this is kind of what I mean. When you have some extra pawns, sometimes you have some possibilities to give back the material. Because now if black does e takes d5, he has knight d4, followed by knight takes f3. So d5 was well timed. Now here, Topalov played e5. He could also consider rook to g7. And after d takes e6, rook to g2 check, king h1, and now knight takes f2. Rook takes f2, rook takes f2, e7. So certainly a computer could probably tell you if black has any chances to hold in these tactical lines. I'm not going to go over the tactics too much, but this move d5 is really the important thing to really take notice of here, giving white some breathing room. So after e5, rook a4. Now this is where the game is decided. If we look at this game as a whole, white was a little better. Topalov defended very resourcefully and then even stole the initiative here. And now I think there's a draw here with knight takes f2, because after king g3 there's this positional sacrifice, e4, king takes f2, rook b2 check, and very likely it's going to be a perpetual check here, because king here is very dangerous because of rook g2, and then king f4, f2, and if rook a1, rook g1. So probably the correct result of this game would have been a draw along those lines. But Topalov, he had to have some kind of hallucination here, because he played f5, which loses the game. Because after knight takes e5, there's really not anything going on. He's just down a couple of pawns. Now, Topalov had to miscalculated something here. And after rook b2, maybe he just missed this move, knight d3. Otherwise, this would be very strong. After knight d3, he protects f2 and hits the rook. So there's no time for knight takes f2. So after rook b7, he's still got to watch out for rook g7. Rook d4. Perhaps this is the move that he missed. Rook b6. Here, rook d2 would not have done anything either, because he could just do rook d4. Similar game. So after rook b7, rook d4, rook b6, d6. This is a clever move. He gives up the d pawn, but because the knight now has to move in order to take the d pawn, white's king gets into the game, and suddenly all of black's pawns are weak. After knight e4 check, king takes f3, white is again up 2 pawns, king g5, h4 check. This is a clever move. If king takes h4, this pawn will fall very quickly. King f6, rook d5, knight c3. The rest is pretty much a mop-up. Rook d8. Now white is up 2 pawns for nothing. Rook b1, rook f8 check, king e6, knight f4 check, king e5, rook e8 check, king f6, knight h5 check, king g6, knight g3. Now he's all set to scoop up the f-pawn. Rook b2, h5 check, king f7, rook e5, knight f1, knight e2, king f6, rook d5, and here black finally resigned, down 2 pawns. So this was a very interesting game. It was a very long game. I think it's a very good start to the match that they play a 75-move game. Topalov turned down a draw. Of course, I see an opening like this Catalan opening where it's an ending and, a dozen moves. And I think the game is going to be drawn very quickly. It's very interesting, too. I was watching this game, and I left my house when they were repeating moves around move 40, and I just thought the game was going to be drawn there. And then they play on. And Topalov, I think he was definitely correct to play on. He just made a tactical blunder when he played f5. So I'm glad that, I'm not going to hide the fact, I'm glad that Kramnik won, and I am rooting for Kramnik here. Topalov has been in great form, but if we look at the tournaments that Topalov has played over the last couple of years, he's done very well, and he's had some amazing comebacks, like winning like 3 games in a row towards the end of tournaments. And that's possible in a lot of these open tournaments, even just because of the players he's beating, even though they're incredibly strong players like Vallejo and Ponomarev and stuff. I think it would be impossible for Topalov to get into a situation where he's going to beat Kramnik 3 times in a row. Just not going to happen. And that's something that he has done in some of these tournaments, but I think in a match, it's just not going to happen. So I think Topalov has to be careful here because it is such a short match, too. You only have 12 games to come back, so if he gets in too big of a hole, he can't just make a couple of draws to kind of calm himself down. So this was a very interesting game, and we will continue to bring you coverage of every game after it's played on chesslecture.com, and we will see you next time.